So welcome to day 2 of this training workshop. In this morning session, so this session right now, we will be talking about compliance, its challenges and strategies for addressing those challenges. My name is already on there and I'm sure I was introduced yesterday. But for the benefit of those who've just joined us today, my name is Titilola Akindende. I am Executive Director of the Local Government Revenue Initiative, which is an initiative of the International Center for Tax and Development, which is the leading global center for research on issues of taxation and development. Yes, it is a pleasure to be here today and to have this opportunity to interact with all of you. We had a really wonderful time yesterday. The level of engagement was fantastic. I thank you all for that. Please keep it going. Right. Where's the clicker? Oh. Sorry, 1 second. So, compliance. Compliance is fundamental for any property tax system. Property tax compliance involves adhering to laws and regulations, including timely payment. So when we talk about compliance, it's really about adhering to the laws and the regulations that govern taxation. And that includes paying your liabilities on time. A high rate of compliance, therefore, ensures that the tax authority and government are able to plan. They raise taxes, they deliver services as well. So when when they know that people will pay the taxes that they've issued them bills for, then they're able to plan based on what revenue they're expecting and therefore able to deliver those services that citizens need. But in turn, a high rate of compliance also means that citizens are able to contribute fairly to the provision of public goods and services that benefits all the citizens. So really, compliance is of two parts. It helps the government to plan, but it also enables you to contribute very fairly to the system and therefore receive services. However, across African countries, we observe low levels of compliance, which result in unequal distribution of the tax burden. And that's really what happens where only a few people are covered in the tax roll, which means those very few people are those who then bear the burden of taxation. So it becomes quite unequitable. And it also leads to low government revenues and ultimately limited public service provision. So low compliance ultimately will undermine the effectiveness of a tax system. Right, so I'm just going to talk about what the trends are for compliance. Low levels of property taxation, tax generation, we observe across system, we can see that, is not unrelated to tax compliance. As can be seen from this chart over here, despite the potential of property taxation compared to other types of taxes, we find that revenue collected on property taxes across countries is actually quite low. And from research data, we find that it usually ranges between 0.1% and 0.4%, so quite low, especially then when you compare it with what we have in more advanced economies, where property tax revenue generation is about 2 to 4% of GDP. So I guess the countries in Africa are trying, but there is a lot more that can be done when you compare those rates. And so with low performance, we find that often local governments do not meet their annual property tax revenue targets and so are unable to deliver services. So something really needs to change in this area. Okay. So let's talk about compliance then. I think we'll just start off talking about what are, the drivers of this of what we're observing in compliance. Property tax compliance is a complex issue. So it's not a simple thing that we can just um, click our fingers and it goes away. And it's influenced by a number of factors across different countries. These include public perception and low trust. How the taxpayer views their government or tax administration, and how much trust they vest in that tax administration is really a big driver or factor that affects compliance. The lack of reciprocity and a broken social contract also has a part to play, where very little services, or no services at all in some cases, are delivered to taxpayers. Compliance is often very low, as the social contract underpinning a good tax system is eroded already. People don't trust that they'll get services, therefore they don't want to comply voluntarily. There's also the cost of compliance, where the costs are high to comply, where what the taxpayer needs to do is a lot, or they find it daunting, you find that they just don't bother. So compliance costs play a role in this. Then there's also, very important, weak and implausible enforcement threat. So if the taxpayers believe that nothing is going to happen if they don't pay their taxes, you can be sure they will not pay their taxes. So unless there's a credible threat that there's going to be enforcement, you find that compliance will remain low. And lastly, I have weak coordination in fostering compliance, especially in centralized systems. So we talked a little bit about it yesterday, where we said coordination within tiers of government and between tiers of government, where it's weak, you find that the system is weak and therefore compliance will be quite weak as well. So now we're going to talk about each of these ones in a bit more detail. So let's take public perception and low trust first. These are a key factor of compliance. In practice, perception and trust themselves are driven by other things. And so we're going to look into what actually results in that public perception and low trust. And the first one that I want, on our slide there is the weak transparency and accountability. Governments often fail to communicate clearly how tax liabilities are assessed, how much revenue is being collected, and how the revenue is being utilized. Often where budgets are published, they tend to be quite aggregated, and when they don't provide enough detail around, what they're showing people. So if you give one top line and say health services, and it's just one line, people don't really understand what it is you're putting before them. And so with such aggregated data, no detail on the breakdown on how these funds that are collected are actually being used, the trust in the system tends to be quite low because people just don't get it. They don't understand what you mean when you put those big headline figures out. So that's one. Another is the perception of inequity and unfairness of the system. So this tends to stem from key aspects of the property cycle. Now, the property tax cycle. So if you're thinking about this in the property tax cycle, there are some specific parts of that cycle that usually, if it's not strong or it's problematic in any way, will feed that perception of inequity and unfairness. And where taxpayers feel that things, it's unequal, it's unfair to me, they will not want to comply. So a key part, for example, is what we talked about yesterday also, is identification and valuation. Many systems use subjective property valuation methods, and or flat rates, resulting in variable tax values for similar properties. So we talked about that yesterday. I could have a 3-bedroom bungalow, for example, with plastered walls and painted walls, and my neighbor has similar 3-bedroom plastered walls and all of that. But for some reason, our tax bills are different. When people see that, they feel that this system is unfair because it's unequitable. Why should I pay more and my neighbor less? What is going on there? So where equity is not being upheld, the principle of equity, both horizontal and vertical, is not being upheld, you find that compliance tends to be low because it's the perception of inequity really comes into play there. And then when there's uneven distribution of the tax burden, with only a few properties being identified, that also worsens the case. So for example, I'm paying my taxes, but I know my neighbor isn't paying any taxes. Or in situations where usually the influential, so they could be political people or wealthy people, when they don't pay taxes or don't pay their fair share of taxes, that also feeds and exacerbates the feelings of inequity and therefore undermines the tax system and the trust in the system. The third point there is limited public engagement and participation in decision making. Citizens often feel a disconnection from governance processes and lack the opportunity for their voices to be heard when it comes to decisions on revenue utilization. Also, legislative provisions sometimes you find that where the law provides that there should be citizen engagement, it doesn't happen. And where that is the case, so for example, maybe part of in the property tax cycle, you're supposed to engage the citizens, for example, in a town hall meeting, and you don't do it as an administration or as a local authority, then you find that people feel disconnected from what's going on, and when they're disconnected like that, they don't want to comply. They don't understand what you're doing. They don't see what you're doing, so they don't want to comply. There's also distrust in government institutions. I think this one is clear. Misuse of public funds and high levels of corruption within tax authorities and government institutions undermine public trust, diminishing compliance rates. So that's self-explanatory. So yeah, bear with me. There we go. Right. No, I'll click twice if it doesn't happen the first time. Right. So the second one that we talked about was the lack of reciprocity and a broken social contract. So a good tax system usually is underpinned by a solid social contract between government, who are providers of services, and the people who contribute their taxes to government in exchange for services. This is especially true for property taxes because of that close link usually between the taxes that are paid on property and local services that are produced, that are delivered. So a good social contract, when I pay and I see the services that you're giving me and the benefits, then I want to comply. However, in many African countries, this social contract has been eroded, one by inadequate provision of public services and weak connections between tax revenues and service delivery. So where people pay those taxes and you don't actually show them the connection between the taxes they pay and the service you deliver, they don't link it and therefore think, what am I paying for? So, yeah. Many governments fail to spend property tax revenues on services. Instead, these revenues are frequently allocated, and it's not always the case, but what we've found in the countries that we've worked across is that very often the property tax revenues come in, and the vast majority of it goes towards paying salaries and operation costs, which in the end means there's a very little, a shortage of funds to provide services, such as healthcare. And then so the local authorities then have to sort of depend on other external grants to try to meet those service obligations. And all of that worsens public perception and further erodes trust and the social contract, leading to this vicious cycle, which is what we have there, of low trust. You find trust is low, and therefore people don't comply. Revenue mobilization becomes low, and then that exacerbates the inadequacy of service provision. And it just continues and continues and continues. And you ask yourself, so where does it end? How do we break this vicious cycle? It's almost like a chicken and egg situation where you're wondering, should we compel the people to pay their taxes first? Or should we deliver services first? Which one, do we do first? But something needs to happen to break that cycle. So, another one of the factors that drive it is high compliance costs. Evidence shows that many taxpayers do not pay tax, make their tax payments due to the high compliance costs associated with complex and costly processes which become burdensome to taxpayers. This is reflected often in the payment systems for taxes. So in some systems, for example, taxpayers are expected first to go get a TIN, a taxpayer identification number, especially if they're first-time taxpayers, following which they then have to register for property tax. And when they register, they're asked to fill forms which require a lot of information, such as what is the value of your property, what are the features of your property. Sometimes taxpayers don't really know how to answer those questions. Obtaining then their bill, once they fill the form, then they have to get a bill. And sometimes it's not just the bill for the current year, it's bills for a number of previous years. And then going to a bank or somewhere to pay. So all of these may work together to feel quite daunting to the taxpayer. And where they are able to complete the process, when it comes to paying, many systems rely on manual cash payments and often require taxpayers to visit local government offices, which again you can imagine in rural areas where offices are quite dispersed. You can have maybe 30 tax centers for serving 77 municipalities. This further discourages, so when they have to travel far to make the payment, again, it discourages them from paying. Now, when a taxpayer is able to make that journey to go and pay, non-integrated e-payment systems that then may require them, having paid maybe at a bank, to then take the receipt to the local authority to have it recorded and then receive a receipt for their tax payment is also quite challenging for them. And so these processes cost time and money and cause a significant psychological burden for taxpayers. Very often they feel anxiety and frustrated with the system, and that can deter them from paying. So when we're dealing with cost of compliance, we should be thinking about how we make it easy for people to comply. And then we also talked about weak and implausible threat of enforcement. So tax compliance and enforcement are distinct, but they're very closely intertwined in the property tax cycle. Effective enforcement or perceived likelihood of enforcement strengthens compliance, whereas weak enforcement contributes to low tax compliance. When voluntary compliance, voluntary compliance is the ideal. We just want to be able to issue the bill and people pay, okay? But we find that in reality, where the threat of enforcement is not there, or where you find that people think, I'm just not going to pay and nothing's going to happen, we find that voluntary compliance quickly diminishes and disappears, basically. So legal frameworks for enforcement may be, and the reasons behind this are many. One we have there is So if we have a weak legal framework, for example, where the law on what you ought to do is not clear or is weak, you find that taxpayers will exploit the law. And a good example of this we found in Malawi, where the law on enforcement says that a taxpayer can be taken to court to enforce their tax liabilities. But if the taxpayer should make a payment towards that liability, then the process halts and has to begin again. So what taxpayers do then is, once they know they've been taken to court, they quickly rush to the office and pay a small amount. And once they pay that very small amount, the law says the process has to start again. So the tax authority is left in this cycle of stop, start, and getting nowhere when it comes to enforcement. So we really need to think about enforcement laws and how legal frameworks can really support enforcement. And even where the laws are strong, limited capacity undermines the government's ability to enforce payments and penalties uniformly across defaulters, particularly where you have big cities. So where there's staffing shortages in a very big city, how do you cover it? So there will be challenges there in terms of actually enforcing tax compliance because you don't have enough staff. So that's one of the capacity issues that we've come across. There's also technological limitations. The absence or limited use of automated systems for revenue management and enforcement also contributes to delays, inaccuracies, and all sorts of problems when it comes to identifying tax defaulters and implementing penalties. There's also the selective enforcement and tax authority credibility. So this often occurs where property owners with political influence or financial influence can receive preferential treatment, which allows them to evade their tax obligations, while others face severe enforcement actions, creating inequalities in the system. So I talked earlier about where those with political connection or financial muscle can evade tax. That contributes a lot to those feelings of inequity, which then makes the credibility, it undermines the credibility of the tax authority. So where we don't see them really going out and enforcing on the rich as well as the poor or the not so rich, then there's that feeling of, well, you're not doing this properly, and so we're not going to pay. So there's that, and then finally there's bribery and collusion. Corrupt practices such as bribery allow property owners to influence tax authorities to overlook their tax liabilities or reduce their penalties. This undermines the integrity of the system and, just basically, therefore, impacts on public trust and perceptions. Okay. Did it? So let me go back. We've done that. And then there we go. Sorry. Okay, centralized. So we also talked about weak coordination in encouraging tax compliance, especially where you have centralized systems. So levels of tax compliance in centralized systems tend to be very low. This is predominantly seen in West African Francophone countries like Togo, Benin, Senegal, and others, of course, where tax collection is with the central authority, while the local authority focuses on other things like sensitization and things like that. So, and those are unique features that you find in centralized system. The central government agency, once they've assumed the full responsibility for property administration, tax administration, local government focus on public awareness and that sort of thing. And in the end, without coordination between the two authorities, you find that compliance is low because there are too many gaps in the system. So these institutional arrangements create some notable challenges. One is due to inadequate coordination between these levels of government to improve tax compliance and strengthen the link between property taxes and services are hindered. Central government, you find, have a lack of drive in collecting these taxes. They're not really, they don't push for it. Meanwhile, local governments, because of their lack of ownership of the system, also do not push for it. And where nobody's pushing for it, what happens? The taxpayers just do not comply in those systems. So overall, it is important to note that investments in enforcement and in building trust are complementary rather than distinct strategies. So think about it. When you invest in enforcement, it's like you're investing in building trust. So a likelihood of detection and penalties for non-compliance, when that is higher, then and then when it is relatively easy and low cost to comply, you find that compliance improves. So when you invest in these things, enforcement, reducing the cost of compliance, and all these factors that we've talked about, you then find that in the medium to long term, voluntary compliance begins to improve. Okay, enough of talking. I want to hear from you now. So we've talked about a number of factors that drive low compliance. But I want to learn from you what are the current trends in property tax compliance in your country. So you remember that I talked about the trends across countries that we've seen, but I'd like to learn from your country if it's improving or what the trends look like. Which demographic groups tend to comply more with property tax regulations and which groups are more inclined to evade property tax? And then lastly, do the challenges presented just now resonate with you and your country experiences? And are there other challenges contributing to low tax compliance in your country? So I'm going to throw the floor open and you can answer, speak to any of those three questions in your intervention. I'd like to learn what the current trends are in your country, which groups tend to want to evade tax or be successful in evading tax, are there, do you identify with some of these challenges? And then are there other challenges that you're facing that haven't been covered? So floor's open. Who'd like to speak first? No one? Anybody? No? Sorry? Okay, shall I give you a couple of minutes to think about it? Are there any compliance challenges that you've experienced that actually haven't been covered here? No, none. Okay, I'll take that to mean that this has covered exhaustively all the challenges that you... Oh, sorry.
Okay, good morning,
Good
House.
morning.
Good morning, everyone. For me, I think property tax compliance or administration is like every other kind of tax administration that you can have. So when you're talking about the compliance trends or challenges, for example, here in Nigeria, you find a lot of properties that are not currently occupied. Maybe they are locked up, the owners are out of country, so that's quite like increasing now. You move into some estates and you find that a lot of houses are locked up without any residents. So even if when you drop your demand notices or something, or you paste it on the gate, you have nobody to attend to them. Then sometimes too, you have properties that are occupied by tenants who are not the original owners of such properties. So when you bring your notices, they tell you, I'm just a tenant, maybe you just have to find where the landlord is and write to him or her directly. But then I'm thinking that there should be somewhere in the law that should say that even if you're not the original owner of that property, but for the fact that you're occupying it, you should answer. You should be able to answer to that. I'm not sure. So it's also a slight challenge where tenants tell you just have to go and find the owner of the property. They are not the owners. Some other things as the fact, for example, in Lagos State, the Lagos State Internal Revenue Service do not administer property tax directly, even though they oversee what revenues come from there. So you find them employing more people just because they need extra hands to drive compliance. And then that also increases cost of the drive, cost of um, collection or compliance. So like you said, so if they get some certain amount of revenue from it, they end up spending majority of it to pay staff, to the tools for the working and all of that. And then you also see that, because of the general hardship right now, globally, so you find people telling you, what has government done for me? I built this house myself. So what's your exact contribution to my property that you're asking me to pay property tax for? Like you said, should the goods that the government do come first, or should the taxpayers pay first? So, you have that struggle all the time. They say, oh, I built my house myself, so why are you asking me to pay? So what have you done? Have you done the road leading to my house, or what exactly? I also have to pay for my electricity bill and all of that. So all of these things are realities, and, they are not far-fetched. And I don't think that what happens here in Nigeria should be completely divergent to what happens in other similar African countries. So, I mean, the challenges are always there. They're
Indeed.
always there.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that intervention. It's quite exhaustive. Yes, I do identify, and we've seen that in many places when tax authorities serve notices and the residents say, "Oh, but I'm not the owner." We'll talk about strategies for addressing these, but just to speak directly to that, you'll recall that Colette spoke yesterday about our experience in Sierra Leone. Their law allows you to serve notice on the owner, but really you don't have to know who the owner is. And then, of course, to take enforcement action against the physical building itself. Now, when the resident, who is a tenant, knows that enforcement will be taken against his home, then they're likely to get in touch with their landlord and say, look, come pay this bill, or strike a deal with the landlord or something. So you're right, the law needs to give us levers to pull when it comes to enforcement. Are there other interventions? Yes.
So, good morning, all. My contribution with in respect of shifting of tax burden. From our sessions yesterday, you agree with me that we understand that we have some components of direct tax, which has to do with the capital gain, the tenement rates, and the land use, the other components. So, for registered lands, what we have seen over the time is that when those registered properties are kept, the owners of those properties don't go to fulfill their statutory requirements on yearly basis. But when they now transfer those properties to another person, at the process of carrying out the assignments, all those responsibility of the former owner, particularly the capital gain tax, which was to be fulfilled by the seller, now goes to the buyer. In most often than not, you notice that the buyer now fulfill those payments, paying the capital gain, paying the outstanding land rent, tenement rate, outstanding neighborhood charge, and every other charges that are attached to the property. So, which means the burden, shifting tax burden from the person who is supposed to pay to a new buyer. Thank you.
That's really interesting. So, yes. What, the gentleman at the back.
Good morning, everybody. I actually want to speak on the question two, the groups who are liable to or who tends to evade tax on property. Uh, Let me say they are retirees, especially the civil servants, when they work in service and they try to gather money to build a house and they are living in it. It is not a commercial house. Only him, the owner, is living in it, and then the land use charge people came and served him a bill. Yeah, he has a complaint. He can complain, he can give an excuse that I'm not working, I'm not getting any money from anywhere. Where do you want me to pay this? So this is an excuse that they can use to evade the tax. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's another interesting one. Those are two things. One is really about passing on the burden of a tax, and the other about retirees.
I have a contribution.
Sorry, who's that?
Yeah.
Just give me 1 second. Let me. So on that, I don't know. On the passing on of the burden of the tax, I think it's a perennial problem, and it's not to do with property taxation alone. If people can do it, they will do it. So even let's move away from wealth taxation. There are taxes that are placed on companies that just go into the prices that they sell things to consumers. They get passed on. So I don't know that it's unique to property taxation, and I don't know really how government can legislate against people passing on burdens. If I strike it, if so, imagine I'm the property owner, and I'm selling it to Dr. Colette here. If I say to Colette, my house is, let's say, 100,000 naira, okay? But because of all these charges you're going to have to incur, I'll sell it to you for 90,000 naira. I've struck a deal with her. She goes to the authorities and sorts out the bills. You can't legislate against something like that, and there's no way of telling from the authorities' side that something like that has gone on. So it's a difficult one to try to legislate or deal with directly. I think what is important is while the owner has that house in their possession, we enforce on the owner, and so that there's no burdens to be passed on when it's being sold. So that's one. And then on the other question, which was about retirees, you're right. And I think that's why you find things like thresholds being in place in many places and exemptions in many places. I think in Sierra Leone, the mayor basically exempted certain people or give them a reduced rate, that sort of thing. Because some people can be asset rich, but not cash rich. And therefore, it's difficult for them to pay. So you're quite right. But that is something that you politically then decide on how to deal with. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I was just going to add to the comment about the retirees. So what happens in Lagos State is they are exempted from paying land use charge, but they do pay tenement rate to the local councils. So that's what applies here.
See. So that answers the question. Right. Any other interventions?
Yeah.
Okay. The
Yes.
gentleman here, before I forget.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I will just speak to item 3. Yes, most of those challenges are what we experience here. However, my focus will be on as regards the government involvement, their level of support. Maybe we need to start projecting the data as regards property tax and its contribution to total tax generated by those countries that are really doing well. So that when we start speaking to this revenue item to the government, they will want to provide that level of support that the revenue authorities need. Because most of them want to focus on the personal income tax, those ones that they know, yes, if we pursue this, we get the relevant revenue item.
Yeah.
And I think the revenue authorities are also, having identified all these challenges, you find states, maybe the revenue authorities that are here can also speak to that. You find them working closely with the local government councils to see how they can jointly collect these taxes, and they have an agreement at the back end on how they can split and collect their cost of collection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yes, a number of things in there. When you're talking about the potential of property tax, I think it's something that it's there, but has been sort of ignored for a long time. So yes, indeed, as you begin to speak to your political leaders, you should be telling them about this. But remember that property tax potential is also kind of linked to the fact that very often property tax collected is linked to local service delivery. And hence, if you start to collect the property taxes and you can link that and visibly show people what those taxes are being used, you're likely to be able to hit that potential. I think there was one last person before we move on.
Yes, I want to talk about capital gain tax. From our end in Ekiti State Internal Revenue Service, it has always been a big challenge to get capital gain tax on property exchange between individuals. But we have made an effort to ensure that any property that is sold, that the agency or ministry that will handle the perfection of the documentation of those properties should insist on getting some specific documents. Taking, for instance, sales agreement, and if it is gift of a land being given to someone, deed of gift, and all the rest. So in those ministries, we insist that those documents should be requested. Number one, so that appropriate stamp duty will be paid while visiting the Commissioner of Stamp Duty in concluding the documentation. Then number two, if a property is being sold to another individual, then at that point we will know an appropriate capital gain tax will be computed, and the appropriate person will be made to pay the capital gain tax. On our end, we do that to ensure that appropriate stamp duty is being paid and capital gain tax is equally being paid. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So, last one then, please. Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, still on the property tax. I think one of my colleagues here has said a lot about it. Concerning the property, I understand some of our subnational level are losing a lot of revenue concerning this property. Why? Because, take for instance, my name was registered with one of the two or three property for the past 10 years. The baton has been passed to another person, and still up to this very moment, they are still serving me the bill to pay. So the inadequate database on some of our subnational level and update of the existing record poses a lot of revenue loss. I don't know the message you are going to pass so that at least the the database and these things can be always be updated to know the actual occupant of the property. Up to this moment, the same bill every year is still serving on me, 2 or 3 property like that. So please, I don't know what the challenges these things could face. Thank you.
I think we can visit those when we talk about identification and valuation strategies. Ideally, when a problem like that comes up, we find that people, if you're served a bill that is on a property that's not yours, you would go to the authorities and say, I sold it to so-and-so at this time. And they then update the records or at least get in touch with the so-and-so. So I find that a bit odd. I'm sure you would have taken those steps already. So it's a bit odd that the database is not being updated, which is I guess a system problem. So yes, indeed. Okay, so let's try to go on now to talk about strategies to improve compliance. We talked about 5 key factors that drive compliance: public perception and low trust, lack of reciprocity, broken social contract, high compliance cost, weak implausible enforcement threat, and weak coordination in fostering compliance, particularly in centralized systems. and you have shared your experiences from your various countries. We now want to turn towards strategies for improving compliance which address the challenges that we have identified. In Logri, we approach these holistically with the aim of strengthening the property tax administration system and compliance. So, central to property tax administration is property identification and valuation. You will recall that I said that some of the, when we're talking about inequity, some of those perceptions come from things that happen in specific areas. So central to property tax administration is identification and valuation. Enhancing property identification and valuation systems to ensure that all taxable properties are accurately identified and properly valued will provide a solid basis for improving equity and fairness and taxpayer perception. So the gentleman over here, if things were accurately done and properly with full coverage of houses and owners, then those problems will not continue, and the perception of unfairness would sort of diminish. Also, strengthening billing, revenue collection, and enforcement systems by streamlining tax collection processes to make it easier for taxpayers to comply, and implementing effective enforcement mechanisms to ensure that all taxpayers contribute their fair shares would be very important as well. So one of the examples that comes to mind is where property is identified and valued, but the billing is weak. And this sometimes happens because one agency takes care of one side of it and another agency the other side. I remember yesterday there was an example given where one agency takes care up to a certain point and then transfers the bills to another agency who's supposed to then distribute it. Where I have heard of examples where, I think it's Kaduna State in Nigeria, where two agencies are involved, and when the bills are printed and given to the other agencies, they sit in a corner on the floor, they don't get delivered. And so the system breaks down. So, of course, strengthening billing, revenue collection, that side of things will also be very useful when it comes to improving compliance. And then also finally strengthening the link between the tax that's collected and the services that are provided will also be quite useful if we're to improve voluntary compliance. So now let's talk about some specific strategies that deal with fairness, transparency in property taxation. Reform experiences show taxpayers are more likely to comply with tax obligations when property taxation processes are transparent and fair. A key part of the property administration cycle is valuation. Where valuation is done well, meeting the principles of horizontal and vertical equity, taxpayers see the system as fair and are more willing to voluntarily comply. Making the valuation public allows property owners to access their property data and to understand how valuations were determined. This helps them to see that properties with that are similar to theirs are being charged the same or similar tax to theirs, and that properties that have higher or lower value are being charged differently. So it's important to work on those things. That transparency is very important. In addition, having a clear dispute and resolution process is important. Taxpayers can challenge and have their disputes resolved and thus further contribute to that perception of fairness. So if you deliver a tax bill to me that gives me all that information about how you arrived at my tax burden or tax liability, then I could, if I disagree, should know that there is a clear process where that dispute can be resolved. Very often, taxpayers don't feel like they have a recourse and feel stuck with this bill that they feel is unfair, and therefore it's difficult for them to continue. Transparency can also be enhanced through tax notices, including detailed information on your tax bills, like I said. So you will see, this is not clear, unfortunately, but this, I think this is from Lagos, actually, where we have that, the land use charge, and it tells you how it's being computed, what the different liabilities are, and so on. So that's great. And then here, this is it from Lilongwe in Malawi. And so they give you all that information about how that bill was arrived at, so that you understand, and if you have a problem, you can come forward and have the dispute resolved. Oops. Okay. Objective enforcement. Objective enforcement signals fairness, especially targeting high value. Sorry. We have that just down there. So we've talked about tax notices, but then there's also an objective enforcement. Where when we talked about it earlier, we talked about how enforcement can be variable, and that also affects perception. So when you have objective enforcement, then people tend to feel that the tax system is fair. And I'll give you a good example from Sierra Leone, actually, where the mayor, before I go into that example, somebody said earlier how expensive it is sometimes to enforce. And that is true. Now, in Sierra Leone, the mayor, recognizing that, decided to target some high net worth evaders or defaulters. And that signaled to the people that she was serious and willing to go after anybody who didn't comply. So sometimes you don't have to go, it's a decision to be made. You have to calculate the cost of enforcement. If it's going to be so expensive to enforce it on the smaller taxpayers, maybe what you want to do then is to target the big ones and send that signal strongly to your people that I will come after you, in which case then you find that people just go and comply. Okay. And so we also talked about public engagement and transparency and accountability. By prioritizing transparency and accountability through clear communication, public engagement, and responsive governance, governments can build trust, gather public support for property taxation, and gradually achieve higher voluntary compliance. Strategies for doing so include providing clear revenue expenditure information to taxpayers. We've talked about that. Publishing information on the allocation of tax revenues across various public services. So one thing we've talked about, putting information on how their liabilities have been arrived at on the bill. The other side of that is you telling them how those revenues that you generate are being used. So being able to publish that information is usually very useful when it comes to encouraging compliance. Making revenue and expenditure reports accessible through budgets and disaggregated data to enhance understanding of your people will be very important for them to be able to voluntarily comply. There's public engagement and parts. So before I move on to public engagement, somebody talked earlier about them saying, I built my house, what have you done for me? Why should I pay? Yeah, somebody was talking about the fact that they built their house and they don't see why they should pay a tax for that house when government doesn't do anything for them. So that goes back to that social contract thing. It is important, as we say here, that you show them on the one side why they're being billed what they're being billed, and on the other side that their money is delivering specific services, if that makes sense. So where you're using their money for waste collection, it should be visible to the people that the tax I paid, my property tax, is what is making them collect my waste. They should be able to make that link. Very important. Then there's public engagement in decision making. So that is another important part. When you begin to engage the citizenship in your decisions, not just on, how they pay their taxes and that sort of, but on what the taxes are being used for, you find that they become more engaged, they become more invested, and want to be a part of this system that's in operation. And a good example of that is what we find in Shama. So one part of that is either through town hall meetings, participatory budgeting, and that sort of thing. But there's also using oversight bodies that include the citizenship to check what is actually happening with those funds. So where you've engaged citizens on how to use the funds that you've collected, it would be also useful. What we found is that where there are oversight functions that include the citizens, then they feel like you're being accountable, and therefore they're more likely to comply. And providing forums where they can then have a seat at the table and discuss these things is also quite important. So we have an example here in this picture. This place is Shama municipality in Ghana. Gives us a good example. They had a program there where they successfully engaged citizens, and they used also public oversight bodies and participation in decision making. So combining all three in Shama, and it worked out really quite successfully. Just before the pandemic, Shama municipality in Ghana, I'm sorry, I'm being told to slow down for the interpreters. Shama municipality in Ghana, they have a population of about 100,000. They implemented a reform that relied on technology, capacity building, and improving taxpayer databases. Key pillars of the reforms were increasing awareness, so they engaged and sensitized about the importance of property taxes, and the willingness of the municipality's leadership to increase transparency in the use of public revenues. The municipality implemented transparent budget allocation by disseminating information about projects implemented by the assembly. They provided project name, location, contract sum, source of funding, and project status. So not just the contract sum, but the source of that funding. And so people can link the project to the taxes that they're paying. They increased public engagement initiatives through town hall meetings and other forums that enable citizens to demand accountability for implementation of district development plans and budgets. Citizens were able to ask questions on the status of projects, to interact with contractors at those meetings, identify challenges, provide recommendations for addressing those challenges. And they were part of the planning and execution. So it really worked well for them in Shama. And it's a good example, really, of how you can actually get your citizens to engage and therefore become more compliant, because they feel like they own it, they feel like they're a part of it, and so they're likely to be more compliant. Outcomes in Shama. So following the implementation of these measures in Shama, local revenue increased by 50% in 2 years, and property taxes itself saw an annual increment of 15.3% from 2019 to 2022. So it works. Great. So we also talked about reducing the cost of compliance. And one of the key strategies here is leveraging technology. So technology offers numerous benefits for property tax collection and payment processes. and the adoption of online digital platforms for e-payments has reduced compliance costs in many of the places that we've seen it done properly. The adoption of e-payment and digital methods like mobile money, MOMO, has advantages of increased convenience and accessibility. For instance, enabling payments through mobile money enables those in remote or rural areas to pay their taxes from their handheld devices. And that makes it the cost of them complying almost zero, because they can do it from the comfort of their own homes. Taxpayers can use the mobile phones, and then lowering that cost then also makes it, and also apart from the fact that they can do it from the comfort of their home, they also save on cost of travel if they have to then go somewhere else. And then having those integrated payment systems will also be quite useful, because then once they've paid, if your systems are well integrated, it should reflect at the local council. So it is noteworthy that for an effective IT system, you have to ensure the adoption of a system that has good interoperability, interoperable systems that enable seamless transfer of and tracking of this information. And they should also be user-friendly, in the sense that they should not be an added burden. So if the platform is really clunky and difficult, then it takes away the accessibility and ease. And then also there's strengthening the link between revenues and services. Establishing that link, as I said, is fundamental actually to effectively improving compliance in property taxation. Strong revenue services link plays a role in garnering trust and support from citizens. Although several strategies exist, we're going to talk about two strategies only. One is revenue earmarking and participatory budgeting, the other one. So we're going to now move into revenue earmarking. Okay, so revenue earmarking entails allocating a share of revenues for specific purposes. So for example, a particular project or a particular expenditure line. Earmarking can be done using a share of all local revenues or from property tax revenues only. So depending on what works for a particular council, you could either say, if we collect, we'll put everything in a common pot and then we'll earmark so much for revenue provision. Or you could say, we're going to keep it specific to property taxes and keep that link with the domestic services very strong. So it's up to you how it works best. And we have here two examples of how it's been done. In Uganda, they allocated 75% of property tax revenues to development projects. In Kenya, what we found that was that county governments are asked to allocate 30% of all revenues. So you will notice that where it's property tax revenue, it's much higher what's allocated to specific services. Where it's all revenues, it tends to be lower because, one, the base is bigger. And then secondly, the link, would be sort of less visible when it's all revenue. So depending on what works, will need to be considered. Now, although earmarking can work sorry, bear with me. Right, so earmarking can work where there's clear legislation saying how much should be earmarked and all of that. We need to also understand that there can be some drawbacks or some challenges when doing an earmarking system. One of those is budget fungibility. So usually, because councils have the room to decide how budgets are used, sometimes when an earmarked amount is sort of allocated to a specific service, the amount that was being spent on that service from another, previously gets taken away, so that at the end of the day, the available funds for that service reduces. So that ability to sort of move money around, you'll need to really think about that in terms of if you say we're going to produce and provide more of this, and we're going to do it through this earmarked fund, remember that you're already spending so much to reach the level you are. And so you need to be thinking about how that works, so that you don't offset the net gain. The lack of specificity in budget and budget transparency, earmarks are only effective where they clearly specify what spending qualifies for inclusion in that spending line. It has to be very specific. So for example, if you say that you're going to provide street lighting, for example, from this earmarked fund, what exactly qualifies as a cost of street lighting should be clear. Is it the salaries? Or is it the actual material that is required to provide street lighting? So there needs to be quite a detailed degree of specificity on what will qualify to be funded from the earmarked fund. And then you should also put in place measures that improve transparency. So when you then do that, you have to also be able to publish some of these things. Thirdly, there is also lack of oversight. So we talked about oversight mechanisms. I think somebody's question brought me to talking about that earlier. Where there's no oversight mechanisms, then these things don't actually happen. Those oversight mechanisms need to be, set up and should include citizens wherever possible, so that there's a system and a mechanism for checking that what needs to be done is actually being done properly. And then to enhance effectiveness, ensuring clear definitions, good quality, revenue and expenditure data are very critical as well. So when you have, sort of checked those boxes and ensure that you're not just moving money around, and you're specific enough in that, you also have to put in place mechanisms to collect the data that enables you to conduct strong oversight and also to provide transparency to the public. So when we talk about clear definitions and improved data, meaningful and effective earmarking is impossible in the absence of clear definitions. How much is to be earmarked? How will the earmarking be done? What expenditures should qualify for the use of earmarked funds? And effective data to track implementation should be clearly set out. This is important because what you find in many local governments is that expenditures are reported in aggregate figures, making it difficult to accurately assess the current levels and share revenues spent on services. To be successful, designing an earmarking system must start with an assessment of the existing spending patterns and the quality of data used for monitoring that spend. So a good place to start is you need to come to a good understanding of actually how you're spending current funds. And once you know that, then you also then know how much you need to earmark and what data you need to be able to supervise that earmarking and providing transparency to the people. Once you do that, this will in turn inform your clear definition. So when you have that sort of forensic assessment of your funds, you will be able to make the decisions on what actually should qualify to be funded from your earmarked fund. So that question about salaries, operational costs, or the actual materials for the street lighting or the waste truck, what should actually go into a cost line becomes clearer to you when you've done that forensic assessment of how you're currently spending. And then the data collection and the mechanisms for doing so will then also, you'll then be able to start to put that in place to supervise the earmarked funds. Okay. Oversight mechanisms. It is one thing to adopt a clear approach to earmarking embedded in legislation and to have clear guidelines and clear reporting expectations. However, this would be meaningless in the absence of strong oversight. Experience across African countries show that earmarking fails due to poor oversight, limited avenues for broader public engagement, and limited transparency and public consultation. So again, in doing this, you need to engage. To be successful, we recommend strong oversight institutions with the involvement of key stakeholders. These include, for example, a two-level oversight where oversight done at the city council level through local councillors perhaps, or lay people within the citizen to strengthen the local budgeting processes with support, and monitoring by the central government or the oversight body or agency in charge of budget monitoring. So for example, in Malawi, the National Local Government Finance Committee does that function. And in Kenya, the Office of the Controller of Budget does it. I think for Nigeria, it would be the JTB. So when you want to have that two-tiered system, your local governments have to have their own strong oversight system. So you can have an oversight committee set up at the local level. But then when it comes to the budgeting, the reporting, there should be supervision from a supervisory body, maybe the JTB, or as is the case in Kenya and Malawi, other bodies that can basically support the local councils in reporting the data as it should be reported. And that then improves transparency because then across board, all the local governments are reporting the same type of data at the same level of disaggregation, all the people are seeing it, and compliance begins to improve. So that's one way. Then you could have specialized joint planning committees. Here, a specialized multi-stakeholder oversight committee for implementation and monitoring of earmarking can be created. A good example of this is in Malawi again. Sorry, we've worked quite extensively in Malawi. We're following the outcomes from discussions from workshops we conducted there. We noted the strong desire of citizens' involvement through the creation of a multi-stakeholder oversight committee. So in engaging with the Malawian administrators and stakeholders, we just noticed that there was that strong drive or push for such an oversight committee that includes even CSOs. So they were quite keen on that. So that's another possible way of providing oversight. And then there's also ring fencing revenues. Here, explicit strategies to ring fence service revenues to ensure budget execution are put in place. So sometimes it's like an escrow account where you then put earmarked fund, or within the budget it's ring fenced so that nothing else touches. Whatever, I guess, process or system works, you need to think about how you are able to identify that fund, keep it from being moved around, and ensure that it is executed appropriately. And then the other way you could engage citizens more is participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is an effective method of strengthening the link between property taxes, tax revenues, and service delivery. This can be done by, one, enhancing transparency in budget decision making. But participatory budgeting includes citizens in decision making regarding how property tax revenues are spent. This transparency helps taxpayers see how exactly money is being used, which builds trust and encourages compliance. Increasing accountability. So participatory budgeting also increases accountability, where citizens have a say in budgeting local governments and are held accountable for their spending. This accountability mechanism can lead to more efficient and effective use of property tax revenues. Also, better aligning expenditures with citizens' need. By involving the citizens in a participatory budgeting process, local governments can ensure that property tax revenues are spent on services and projects that reflect the citizens' priorities and needs. This alignment can improve public satisfaction with local services and therefore encourage compliance. So, we're going to share the experience of this in Freetown. It was, so as part of the reform we supported in Freetown, the mayor wanted to give taxpayers a voice, so they set up a participatory budgeting mechanism. The Freetown City Council held virtual town halls to identify citizens. Bear in mind, this was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So they had to be virtual town halls. They were held through WhatsApp groups. Each chat group consisted of about 17 to 37 participants. And the deliberations there allowed horizontal talking, so where participants discuss amongst themselves what services they would like to be provided per ward. It also, through that discussion, they were able to express what their preferences were and articulate it on the platform. And also through that platform, they were also able to have vertical interactions with their councillors by video sometimes, to voice their preferences and to sort of reveal the list of services that they would provide. Participants deliberated and voted for preferred services. Each project was then assigned 15 million leons. And the mayor announced the winner, so which service was going to be provided and given this money, also through video. And it worked quite well. Early evidence on participatory budgeting shows that it successfully promoted public participation in defining services and project priorities. The experience has also led to a positive shift in attitudes towards government, potentially facilitating a virtuous cycle of improvements by enabling support for property taxation. So because people are able to engage with their councillors and with the tax authorities, it sort of shifted the view of government from being quite negative to becoming more positive. Then also the reform positively impacted the approval rating of local government officials. So before they were like, you're not doing anything, so there's no regard really for them. But with that engagement on that platform, we found that it impacted their approval rating. And in that situation, these are elected officials. So when your approval rating goes up, what happens? They vote for you next time. So worth engaging with them. And then the experience demonstrates that positive shifts in attitude towards the government can potentially increase voluntary compliance in the medium to long term. The reform has effectively created a link between taxation and local services. In the first year, the project was funded by international donors, but subsequently, the Freetown City Council has committed 20% of local property taxes towards funding these projects, so it continues. In conclusion, and I'm going to be very quick. In conclusion, tax compliance is a crucial component of any property tax system. Voluntary compliance is influenced by various factors at each stage of the property cycle. Strategies for enhancing compliance differs from across contexts. Reform experiences indicates that the most effective strategies involve increasing transparency in property taxation processes, active citizen engagement through the property tax cycle, the ability of government to demonstrate the fairness and equity of the system, strengthening the link between property tax payments and services, and then clearly communicating the benefits derived from paying taxes. So with that, I say thank you for listening.